As chaos erupted in the Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn managed to track Frodo's prince to the summit of Amon Hen. But he spied no sign of any hobbits, and then began to hear the sound of a company of orcs nearby. The great horn of Boromir then began to blow in the woods, and Aragorn rushed back. There he found Boromir, dying and littered with black arrows. Countless orcs laid at his feet, and Boromir with his last breaths repented his actions and revealed the orcs had taken Merry and Pippin. Aragorn now had the unenviable task of finding all the hobbits, most importantly Frodo the Ring-bearer and the ring itself. Gimli and Legolas then found him kneeling by Boromir's body. Looting the dead orcs, Aragorn found Merry and Pippin's knives and noticed something strange about the orcs. They seemed to be from neither the Misty Mountains nor Mordor, and were marked instead with an S rune on their helms. He guessed they were Uruk-hai from Isengard, under the command of Saruman. The three took Boromir's body and laid it in a boat, setting it to sail down the Anduin. They also noticed one of the original boats was missing, as Aragorn and Legolas sang songs of mourning. Aragorn correctly deduced that Frodo had fled with Sam, and decided that the best course was to rescue Merry and Pippin, for Frodo and Sam's trail would be much harder to track. Thus Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, man, elf, and dwarf, set out for a great hunt for the orcs that had taken their friends. Their path took them to the wide plains of the Rohirrim, for the orcs were presumably returning to Saruman's base of power in Isengard. Legolas found several dead orcs, but they were from the north and there was no sign of the hobbits. With his keen eyes, however, he was able to spot the orcs once more, nearly 12 leagues away. They seemed to be moving with a great haste, and Aragorn soon found Pippin's leaf brooch from Lorien. Day after day they pressed on. Little life they encountered, for the land seemed entirely empty. One day, they awoke to a red dawn, an evil omen as they approached Fangorn Forest. Later, Legolas spied a company of human riders bearing their way, led by a tall leader with yellow hair. Aragorn decided to wait for them, as their hunt thus far had been fruitless. The tall, powerful riders approached, and Aragorn strode forwards, asking of news from the north. Their leader was Eomer, 3rd Marshal of the Riddermark and nephew to King Theoden of Rohan. He mistrusted the three until Aragorn drew Andúril and proclaimed himself Elessar, the heir of Elendil. He seemed to have grown in stature while Eomer had shrunk, and in his living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of the Kings of Stone. Aragorn told Eomer war with Sauron was at the doorstep of Rohan, and asked if he had seen the hobbits at all. Eomer replied they had found a company of orcs, but had slaughtered them and burned the bodies, with no sign of any halflings. He was dismayed upon learning of the falls of Boromir and Gandalf, and reassured the company that Rohan was not, in fact, paying tribute to Sauron. Instead, their main threat for the time was Saruman the White, and his stronghold of Isengard and the Tower of Orthanc. Eomer told the three their company would be welcome in Rohan, for orcs were swarming their lands. Aragorn, however, insisted that first they continue to search for Merry and Pippin. Eomer relented, and gave them 2 horses to aid in their quest. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli then departed, and soon reached the edge of the Fangorn Forest. There they found a burning pile of bodies. After a long search around the area, they could not find any sign of the hobbits, and began to fear the worst. Night fell, and dark shadows began to dance across the mysterious woods. For long ago, Ents were rumored to dwell within the trees, who seemed to be almost sentient. As they slept, Gimli awoke and saw in the distance an old man, standing silent and motionless. Not knowing if he was Saruman or not, Aragorn approached him, but he abruptly vanished. However, it then turned out that their horses had bolted as well. It is then revealed that during the fiasco at Amon Hen, Merry and Pippin were attacked by a large force of orcs while searching for Frodo. They were defended valiantly by Boromir, who slew dozens before being cut down with countless arrows. The hobbits were knocked out and abducted. Pippin woke up later being carried by the Uruk-hai, and saw an ashen Merry who seemed to be wounded. As the orcs fled to Isengard, Pippin learned their group was composed of several tribes. They began to argue over whether to kill the hobbits, but then one of the leaders informed them the hobbits may have something important for the war effort. The bickering continued, until the swords were drawn and a fight broke out. The Uruk-hai of Isengard came out on top, and decided to make haste for Isengard before they were discovered by the Rohirrim. To move faster, Merry and Pippin were healed by a foul-tasting orc liquid and had their bonds cut. To create a trail in hopes Aragorn may be able to find them, Pippin threw his brooch on the ground, knowing the hobbits' footsteps were hidden by the larger ones of the orcs. Eventually, the hobbits' condition worsened, and they fell unconscious. They awoke again, and more orcs broke away from the main group, leaving only the ones from Isengard as their captors. However, several from the north also remained behind, and one named Grishnak sauntered forward. In the distance, Pippin also caught a glance of a company of Rohirrim bearing on their position. All the orcs began to run, and the stronger Isengardians soon overtook the others that had left previously. They made for the Fangorn forest, but became surrounded. Merry and Pippin were bound again as the 200 or so orcs set up camp. The Isengard leader rushed off to quell unrest brewing in the camp, but then Grishnak crept up to the hobbits, intent on finding the ring. He snuck them away into the forest, but the glint of swords shined for a brief moment and he was shot by an arrow and ridden down by a Rohirrim. Merry and Pippin hid in the forest and were able to cut their bonds. They ventured further into the Fangorn, an ancient and mysterious place. Out of the shadows the hobbits peeped, gazing back down the slope. Little furtive figures that in the dim light looked like elf children in the deeps of time, peering out of the wildwood in wonder at their first dawn. Elsewhere, the Isengard orcs were slain by the riders of Rohan, and Eomer himself slew their leader in combat with swords. Merry and Pippin ventured further into Fangorn, eventually coming to a rock wall and a staircase leading up. They climbed it, and there encountered an ancient Ent of the forest. The Ent appeared to be a gnarled man in the form of a tree, towering to be nearly 14 feet high. Its deep gaze caught Pippin as the hobbits were swept up in its great arms. One felt as if there was an enormous well behind them, filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking. But their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree, or on the ripples of a very deep lake. In a deep, resonating voice, the Ent introduced himself as Treebeard, and seemed to be old beyond measure. He recalled things that were present when the world was first created long ago, and now took Merry and Pippin to his home. The forest took on a mystical feel, with Treebeard talking to himself in the humming, musical language of the Ents on their journey. Along the way, Merry and Pippin learned the Ents were shepherds of the trees of sorts, but were unfortunately lessening in number. They came to Treebeard's house some 70,000 Ent strides later, and told him of their journey from the Shire. Treebeard listened intently, and was most interested in news of Gandalf and Saruman. He claimed the Ents had no interest in the current war against Sauron, but as Saruman had turned to evil and was a neighbor of the forest, Treebeard began to grow concerned. He is plotting to become a power. He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things, except as far as they serve him for the moment. Treebeard cursed Saruman for bringing orcs to his forest and destroying its trees to fuel the war machines of Isengard. He decided to gather the remaining Ents for a council, lamenting that only 3 of the original Ents remained alive: himself, Leaflock, and Skinbark. For long ago, the Entwives were lost, the beings who cared for the smaller and fairer trees of the world. While the Ents wandered the great forests, the Entwives have taught the men of old the craft of farming and cultivation. Their lands laid across the great river Anduin, yet at some point were laid to waste, and the Entwives all vanished. The Ents were distraught, and spent many long years searching for them to no avail. Eventually they came to the place of the gathering for the Entmoot, where 24 other Ents had come at the summoning of Treebeard. The meeting commenced in the meandering, slower language of the Ents. After several days, the Ents decided to march on Isengard against Saruman. Treebeard told Merry and Pippin this last march of the Ents would likely be their doom. Aye, we may help the other peoples before we pass away. Still, I should have liked to see the songs come true about the Entwives. I should dearly have liked to see Fimbrethill again. But there, my friends, songs like trees bear fruit only in their own time and their own way. and sometimes they are withered untimely. And as they approached Nan Curunir, the Valley of Saruman, the Fangorn itself seemed to rustle with life. Elsewhere, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arose in the morning, fearing that the old man they saw earlier was a phantom of Saruman. They searched the scene of the bodies once more, and then Aragorn found tracks of a small prisoner who had seemingly freed himself. He hoped it was one of the hobbits, and they decided to follow the tracks into the Fangorn forest. As the three ventured in, Legolas sensed they were being watched by the trees, which also seemed to rustle in anger. They then reached the Hill of Treebeard and climbed to the top. Then the old man appeared in the distance and began to walk towards them, his face hidden. The hunters drew their weapons, but the old man shed his cloak and quickly disarmed them all. Before them stood a wizard, clothed in white. It was not Saruman, but Mithrandir. They all gazed at him. His hair was white as snow in the sunshine, and gleaming white was his robe. The eyes under his deep brows were bright, piercing as the rays of the sun. Power was in his hand. Between wonder, joy, and fear, they stood and found no words to say. Mithrandir was able to recall his name of Gandalf, and told them he was now effectively Saruman the White, or what he should have been. He was apprised of the events since his fall, and was pleased to learn that Sam had accompanied Frodo into Mordor. Gandalf then informed them that Sauron, their great enemy, feared the traveling of the ring, and thus he had made an error. His forces were now in motion, and set towards the great city of Minas Tirith, where he believed the heir of Elendil would rise. Mordor was not nearly as impenetrable now as once before, which gave Frodo a fighting chance to destroy the ring. Additionally, since Saruman now sought the ring for himself, he had effectively become a rogue third party in the war. The news, however, worsened, for the Nazgul had entered the fray once more, but this time on the backs of monstrous winged beasts. Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas were relieved to hear that Merry and Pippin were in the care of Treebeard and the Ents. Gandalf then counseled them that the ring, as well as Merry and Pippin, were far beyond their reach. The most imminent problem they faced now was the brewing war in Rohan. That is not the road that you must take. I have spoken words of hope, but only of hope. Hope is not victory. War is upon us and all our friends, a war in which only the use of the ring could give us surety of victory. It fills me with great sorrow and great fear, for much will be destroyed and all may be lost. I am Gandalf, Gandalf the White, but black is mightier still. Their task now was to ride to Edoras and seek out King Theoden, to offer the sword Andúril his aid. Gandalf then recounted his epic battle with the Balrog of Moria. Long I fell, and he fell with me. His fire was about me. I was burned. Then we plunged into the deep water, and all was dark. Cold it was as the tide of death. Almost it froze my heart. We fought far under the living earth, where time is not counted. Ever he clutched me, and ever I hewed him, till at last he fled into dark tunnels. They were not made by Durin's folk, Gimli son of Gloin. Far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. Eventually, Gandalf chased the Balrog all the way back to Khazad-dûm, where they reached the fabled Endless Stair. They climbed to the high peak of Celebdil, and did battle once more. It was a stormy, chaotic fray, but Gandalf overcame his foe and threw him down off the mountain. Then darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time, and I wandered far on roads I will not tell. I was sent back, for a brief time, until my task is done. I was alone, forgotten, without escape upon the hard horn of the world. There I lay staring upward, while the stars wheeled over, and each day was as long as a life age of earth. Faint to my ears came the gathered rumor of all lands, the springing and dying, the song and weeping, and the slow, everlasting groan of overburdened stone. There Gwahir the Eagle found Gandalf and bore him away. He brought the wizard to Lothlorien at the command of the Lady Galadriel, where he fully became Gandalf the White. Now he brought several messages to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. To Aragorn I was bidden to say this: Where now are the Dunedain, Elisar, Elisar? Why do thy kinfolk wander afar? Near is the hour when the law should come forth, and the grey company ride from the north. But dark is the path appointed for thee. The dead watch the road that leads to the sea. To Legolas she sent this word: Legolas, Greenleaf, long under tree, in joy thou hast lived, beware of the sea. If thou hearest the cry of the gull on the shore, thy heart shall then rest in the forest no more. Gimli himself received kind words and cautioned to not cut down trees at a whim with his axe. Gandalf then led them out of the Fangorn and whistled sharply into the air. Several horses appeared, including Shadowfax, the legendary horse of the White Rider. They set out for Medusild, the hall of King Theoden. They passed into the Gap of Rohan after several hours, a land torn apart by war. A smoke seemed to rise up and darken the sun's disk to the hue of blood, as if it had kindled the grass as it passed down under the rim of earth. The hunters finally reached Edoras, the mighty capital of Rohan with its golden thatched roofs. It was a chilly welcome they received, and they also learned an advisor named Grima Wormtongue had recently come to prominence in Theoden's court, and had forbidden all strangers from entering the city. Gandalf was able to get them escorted to the halls of the king, where its doorward Hamas stopped them. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli were all disarmed, with Gandalf managing to convince Hamas to let him keep his staff. They passed several tapestries, including one of Earl the Young riding to battle in the field of Celebrand. Theoden King was a hunched, bent man in his throne, with long white hair but a fierce light in his eyes. He mistrusted the intentions of Gandalf, the result of manipulations from Wormtongue, who sat by the king's side. Dark were the tidings in Theoden's halls, for 5 days ago his son Theodred was slain by orcs, and it seemed even Eomer had fallen out of the king's good graces. Wormtongue continued to sow distrust of the traveler's intentions in the mind of the king, until Gandalf had had enough. He shed his cloak and stood straighter, addressing Grima directly. The wise speak only of what they know, Grima, son of Galmod. A witless worm you have become. Therefore be silent, and keep your forked tongue between your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a serving man till the lightning falls. Gandalf raised his staff, darkening the skies outside and causing thunder to roll throughout the halls of Edoras. Wormtongue was thrown to the ground as Gandalf approached Theoden, urging him to find his courage and fight the enemy to defend the land of the Mark. And the king was re-strengthened, standing tall and proud once more as his niece Eowyn rushed into the halls. Thus Aragorn for the first time in the full light of day beheld Eowyn, Lady of Rohan, and thought her fair, fair and cold, like a morning of pale spring that has not yet come to womanhood. And she now was suddenly aware of him, tall heir of kings, wise with many winters, grey-cloaked, hiding a power she yet felt. Eomer was freed, and Gandalf now counseled Theoden to look towards the growing threat in the east. In a quiet voice, he told the king of the quest of Frodo and the One Ring. Theoden was reinvigorated, and power filled him once more as Eomer returned to the halls and gave him his sword, and the riders of Theoden were summoned in a clear, ringing voice. Arrive now! Arise, riders of Theoden! Dire deeds awake, dark it is eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. Forth, Eorlingas! The guards and soldiers of Rohan were rejuvenated upon seeing strength in their king again. The riders were ordered to march, and Wormtongue was brought before Theoden. His secret loyalty to Saruman was then exposed by Gandalf, for the corrupt advisor looked to weaken Rohan and had also been eyeing Eowyn. Theoden told Wormtongue he could prove his loyalty in battle, or be exiled and killed should they ever cross paths again. Wormtongue chose to spit at the feet of the king, and fled the city. Gandalf recalled how the valor of Eomer, who inadvertently rescued Merry and Pippin near Fangorn, dealt a great blow to the enemy and would have never happened if he had not defied the commands of Grima. As the Rohirrim prepared to set out, a last feast was held. Eowyn began to grow more attracted to Aragorn, but the heir of Elendil became troubled, for his heart already laid with another, Arwen Evenstar. Theoden prepared to depart Edoras, leaving Éowyn behind to rule in his stead. Gandalf was given Shadowfax as a gift for his aid, and the host of Rohan left for war. They rode for the fords of Isen, where the men of Rohan were already battling the orcs of Saruman. A black storm of Mordor swept over the misty mountains towards their army, and the air grew hazy and heavy. Then a soldier from the fords found their host, informing them they had been driven back by a massive force of orcs and wild men of the hills in Dunland. Erkenbrand of Westfold and his men were scattered, and Theoden began to desire to ride out and rescue his loyal lord. But Gandalf then advised him on a different course, telling the king to make for Helm's Deep. He then departed quickly, saying he had an urgent errand. So south went the army of Theoden to Helm's Deep, a deep gorge in the White Mountains that offered a strong defensive position. Erkenbrand had made it to the great fortress, and had already re-strengthened its defenses before the outbreak of the war. The Rohirrim traveled with haste, and behind them could see the black wave of Saruman's Uruk-hai chasing them. Then they saw torches, countless points of fiery light upon the black fields ahead, scattered like red flowers or winding up from the lowlands in long flickering lines. The vales and fields of Rohan were burned by the enemy as the Rohirrim passed through the gates of the Hornburg. The defenses were quickly prepared, for the host of Isengard soon fell upon the men of Westfold. Orcs stormed over Helm's Dyke as the night grew late, but were repelled. The main walls were not under attack yet, but now the sheer might of Saruman's army was apparent to Rohan. The trumpets sounded, and the enemy threw itself forwards towards the gates. Battering rams were brought forward as Aragorn and Éomer looked on, stationed on the Deeping Wall. They snuck around through a secret door, and led a force that attacked the rams. As they retreated back to the walls, they were ambushed and Éomer was nearly slain by orcs, but was saved by Gimli. Yet the armies of Isengard continued to sweep upon the walls of the Hornburg like an endless sea, and though the dead piled up, the defenders began to tire. Aragorn and Éomer rallied them many times, but then a new assault fell upon a small culvert, where orcs were able to infiltrate and get behind the walls. Aragorn, Gimli, and the soldier Gambling drove them back, and the culvert was refortified. However, sometime later, Saruman was able to destroy the culvert entirely, and a massive final assault was launched. As Legolas and Gimli competed for the most kills, the defenders were forced to fall back. The Deeping Wall was taken, and many retreated into the caves of the mountain. There was also Theoden, who began to worry the Hornburg may fall for the first time in its ancient history. The world changes, and all that was once strong proves unsure. How shall any tower withstand such numbers and reckless strength? Still, there was no sign of Gandalf, and Theoden began to desire to ride out in battle one last time. At dawn, he planned to sound the horn of Helm Hammerhand and ride out with one last force. Aragorn offered to join him, and returned to continue a valiant defense of the inner walls. Time and time again, the orcs attacked and were repelled, and the majesty and power of Aragorn heir of Elendil was proven to be great many times over. The last gate, however, fell, and orcs swarmed in. And then, sudden and terrible, from the tower above, the sound of the great horn of Helm rang out. Horn blasts echoed throughout the mountains, sowing fear and unease in the orcs. The riders of Rohan called to their king, and he answered. His horse was white as snow, golden was his shield, and his spear was long. At his right hand was Aragorn, Elendil's heir, and behind him rode the lords of the house of Earl the Young. Light sprang in the sky. Night departed. The forces of Rohan poured out in full might, beating back the orcs. Ahead them rode Theoden and Aragorn, hewing down any that stood before them. And the enemy fled, despairing at the might of the defenders. Their backs were to the swords and spears of the riders, and their faces to the valley. They cried and wailed, for fear and great wonder had come upon them with the rising of the day. Theoden led the Rohirrim all the way back to the dike, where they saw the land had changed, for the wide dale had now been replaced by a dark sea of trees. The fleeing orcs frantically tried to escape, but the surrounding walls of rock were too steep. Then suddenly upon a ridge appeared a rider, clad in white, shining in the rising sun. Over the low hills the horns were sounding. Behind him, hastening down the long slopes, were 1,000 men on foot. Their swords were in their hands. Amid them strode a man tall and strong. His shield was red. As he came to the valley's brink, he set to his hips a great black horn and blew a ringing blast. For Gandalf had returned to the aid of Rohan, and had found the missing Erkenbrand to deliver the orcs to their final doom. The enemy was decimated, the survivors of that deadly final attack fleeing into the dark forests, and none would ever return. The lords of Rohan were reunited with their king, and Eomer and Gimli survived their ordeal in the caves. Led by Gandalf, they then decided to ride to Isengard to confront Saruman. The wild men who fought with Saruman were treated with mercy, banned simply from ever crossing into the fords of Isen again. Gandalf, Theoden, and the 3 hunters then led a company through the mysterious forest, as Gimli recounted to Legolas the beautiful works he saw in the caves of the mountains, which he claimed would entrance any dwarf who gazed upon them. As they rode, they encountered a group of Ents, making haste for the north. At some point later, the tree suddenly disappeared from near the Hornburg, taking with them all the bodies of the slain orcs. The trees returned to the Fangorn, and that land near Helm's Deep was called Death Down from there on after. The company of riders arrived at Isengard, the formidable fortress of the corrupted Saruman the White. Orthanc, his citadel, laid in the center of a vast plain raised to fuel his industry of war. Gandalf rode ahead, passing the great Pillar of the Hand, which was formerly white but now stained red. There he found Isengard sacked, a swirling pool of water surrounding Orthanc. Somehow, the power of Saruman was vanquished, and in the distance they saw 2 small figures resting on rubble by the gates. It was none other than Merry and Pippin, and they approached a bewildered King Theoden, welcoming him to Isengard. Saruman was imprisoned within Orthanc, alongside the treacherous Wormtongue. The Ents had marched on Isengard, conquering it and setting up a careful watch of the imprisoned wizard. Theoden rode on, looking to see Saruman for himself and to meet Treebeard. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli then reunited with the hobbits they had spent so long searching for. They all sat down for a meal in the famous Longbottom Leaf, and Merry and Pippin told their friends of what had happened after the Entmoot. The Ents made for Isengard amidst the rustling, moving trees of the Huorns, which seemed to be Ents themselves who had nearly transformed into full trees. Upon reaching Isengard, the Ents saw the forces of Saruman marching away to battle King Theoden. They then strode to the gates of the compound and demanded Saruman come forth. Weapons had no effect against them, and after several minutes of this, the Ents simply tore the gates down. All the remaining orcs were killed, but the wild men were allowed to escape. Saruman fled into Orthanc and called forth fires to dispel the Ents. The Ents were enraged and destroyed whatever vestiges of Isengard they could find. However, the Tower of Orthanc they could not break, for its stone was peculiar and smooth. Eventually, Treebeard commanded the Ents to set a watch over Orthanc, and the rest dispersed into the north. They guided the Isen back towards Isengard, preparing to unleash its waters. At some point later, Gandalf came to them in a great rush, and asked for the aid of the Huorns in the Battle of Helm's Deep. The Ents then broke the dams around Isengard, flooding the plain and washing away the stain of Saruman. Wormtongue, exiled from Rohan, then came to a flooded Isengard. He tried to flee, but was caught and imprisoned by Treebeard. There the tale of Merry and Pippin ended, and now the companions moved to catch up to Gandalf and Theoden. They reached the ruins surrounding Orthanc, and prepared to enter the Dark Tower. Gandalf, Theoden, Eomer, Legolas, and Gimli all decided to approach the doors, with the riders of Rohan lingering behind them. A honeyed voice answered them, for Saruman still sought to sway whoever he could to his cause. Softly he spoke to all present, emerging from Orthanc. The riders of Rohan were immediately spellbound, beginning to sympathize with Saruman and questioning the motives behind the war. Theoden himself was almost swayed, and Gandalf did not intervene, for he deemed this conflict Theoden's to overcome. Gimli fought off the spell, as did Eomer. After a long pause, Theoden himself then finally overcame the words of Saruman. "When you hang from a gibbet at your window for the sport of your own crows, I will have peace with you in Orthanc. So much for the house of Earl. A lesser son of great sires am I, but I do not need to lick your fingers, turn elsewhither, but I fear your voice has lost its charm." Saruman was turned to rage, and the spell over the riders of Rohan became fully broken. Gandalf laughed, breaking his power once and for all, and asked the former Wizard of Renown to come down from his tower. When Saruman refused, remaining belligerent, Gandalf instead cast him from the Order of the Wizards and broke his staff. Wormtongue then threw a strange ball at Gandalf, one of smooth, dark crystal with a glowing center, but missed. It was picked up by Pippin, but quickly taken by Gandalf. They left Orthanc, and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli were then introduced to Treebeard. The Rohirrim and the remnants of the former Fellowship of the Ring then left Isengard, entrusting the Ents to keep watch over Saruman. The company made way to return to Edoras, with Gandalf puzzling over how Isengard and Mordor were able to maintain a steady stream of communication. Upon stopping for one night to camp, Pippin became overcome with curiosity of the dark stone he had picked up earlier. He snuck over to Gandalf and took the crystal and stared into its depths. Pippin became ensnared by its magic, for the stone was a palantir of old, and now Sauron himself locked his gaze on Pippin. The hobbit cried out and collapsed, and was found and revived by Gandalf. Shaking, the hobbit told Gandalf how Sauron had questioned him, but miraculously, no information of Frodo or the One Ring was given to the enemy. Complete disaster was averted, and Aragorn then took the palantir for safekeeping. Regardless, Sauron now knew that a hobbit resided in Isengard, and Gandalf knew the enemy did not know yet in totality of the defeat of Saruman. Emissaries would presumably be sent soon from Mordor, and then in that moment a Nazgul swooped over them on its winged beast. They sped back to Helm's Deep, but Gandalf changed course and took Pippin on a route towards Minas Tirith while the rest continued on. It was a race to warn the Great White City in time before the wrath of Sauron fell upon it. As he fell slowly into sleep, Pippin had a strange feeling. He and Gandalf were still as stone, seated upon the statue of a running horse, while the world rolled away beneath his feet with a great noise of wind. All while the war was unfolding in Rohan and the other realms of men, Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee continued their daring quest into Mordor to destroy the One Ring. 3 days passed after the breaking of the Fellowship, and the two hobbits found themselves wandering on the rocky heights of the Emyn Muil, searching for a way down towards Mordor. However, they became lost and could not find a way down the barren cliffs. Dark were the times for Frodo and Sam, who were tiring and running preciously low on supplies. Sam hoped they had managed to lose the creature Gollum in the hills, but Frodo was less sure. They at last came to a steep drop, and were left with no other option but to attempt a descent. A vicious storm struck them, and Frodo slipped down. Amidst the wind they also heard the shrill cries of the Nazgul, and terror hit them. Frodo was unharmed, but far out of the reach of Sam. Sam then remembered the elven rope they had from the boats, and they were able to use it to descend down the rest of the way. The rope magically untied when they reached the bottom, and fell back into Sam's hands. However, they also spied Gollum following them, and quickly found a hiding place. Gollum hissed and cursed the hobbits as he crept towards Frodo and Sam. Sam leapt out of his hiding place to capture him, but was caught off guard by the strength and tenacity of Gollum. But Frodo then drew his sword Sting, and cowed Gollum into being tied up with the elven rope. Sam argued they kill him and move on, but Frodo remembered Gandalf's words in Moria and decided to spare him. The hobbits rested, and it was deemed that Gollum would be their guide into Mordor. The rope seemed to hurt Gollum, and he swore to help Frodo and Sam so it could be taken off. The three unlikely companions set out, with Sam remaining wary and distrustful of Gollum. They reached the marshes that surrounded Mordor, running desperately low on food except for their stores of lembas bread, which was nourishing but of little taste. The marshes were near the infamous plain of Dagorlad, where the fabled battle against Sauron had taken place in 3434 of the Second Age. Though the marshes reeked and were a foul place, it was still a safer option than traveling through orc lands. It was a cold, clammy trek, and the hobbits learned the dead marshes were haunted by the spirits of the fallen from that battle long ago. Eerie lights and dead faces danced in the water around them and the fog ahead. Gollum instructed them to avoid the lights, or risk being dragged down into the fens by the spirits. Then a cloud in the distant night sky started to grow larger, and it flew over the marshes, terrifying Gollum. For it was another of the ring wraiths, and as they hid, Frodo was reminded of just how close to the enemy's doorstep they were. The ring was a heavier burden than ever, and his pace had slowed considerably. He was now beginning to feel it in actual weight dragging him earthwards, but far more he was troubled by the Eye. The Eye, that horrible growing sense of a hostile will that strove with great power to pierce all shadows of cloud and earth and flesh and to see you, to pin you under its deadly gaze, naked, immovable. It was an invisible presence constantly felt by Frodo but unnoticed by Sam. Instead, the loyal hobbit was more concerned with Frodo's worsening condition as they drew closer to the mountains of Mordor. The barren, desolate land seemed to almost choke them as they approached it, fire and noxious fumes blasting from the earth. Frodo grew ever more tired, his burdens accumulating. He lost count of time, hovering between sleep and walking, until forgetfulness came over him. Then one evening, Sam woke in the middle of the night to the sound of Gollum talking to himself, seemingly in an argument between two different personalities. He overheard one of the voices, Gollum, pushing to take the ring from Frodo, saying a mysterious she could help. Sam was well aware the ring was corrupting Gollum, but puzzled over the female entity he was talking about. Feigning ignorance, he rose and stretched, awakening Frodo, for the time had come to approach the vaunted black gates of Mordor. At last they left behind the marshes and wasteland of Dagorlad, but now the mountains of Ered Luthuli loomed before them, as well as the towering teeth of Mordor, two towers that used to belong to the men of Gondor. Between them laid Morannon, the Black Gate, and the hobbits looked on in despair as the battlements were marshaled for the day, and the fires and trumpets of Mordor came to life. The gate appeared to be impassable, and Gollum urged them to find an alternative way. Frodo remained determined to find a way into Mordor, and Gollum then proposed a different route in, one that was dangerous but ran less risk of the ring being detected by Sauron. Sam remained distrustful of Gollum, but the hobbits had no other option. Gollum told them their new course went through the abandoned Tower of the Moon, the former stronghold of Isildur, the first king of Gondor. Foul creatures called the Silent Watchers and orcs lurked in its shadows, but the hobbits agreed to try it. It would take them to the high pass of Cirith Ungol. They remained near the gate, hidden by their elven cloaks. 4 Nazgul then appeared overhead, driving the all-too-familiar chilling fear into Frodo. They sped away to Mordor, and then a force of men came forth, approaching the Black Gate. They were the Haradrim, a cruel race of men from the east who rode monstrous Oliphants to battle. The hobbits set out for Cirith Ungol, finally passing out of the wastelands and into the fairer land of Ithilien, where there were woods and streams. It was a brief respite where they were able to wash themselves, and they set up camp. Sam had Gollum hunt some rabbits and gather herbs for a stew. Frodo slept for a while, during which Sam reflected on the deep love he felt for his friend. He was reminded suddenly of Frodo as he had lain, asleep in the house of Elrond after his deadly wound. Then as he had kept watch, Sam had noticed that at times a light seemed to be shining faintly within, but now the light was even clearer and stronger. Frodo awoke and they ate the stew. However, soon after they finished, a party of 4 human warriors found them, tracking the smoke of their fire. Their leader was Faramir, captain of Gondor and brother of Boromir, and he asked what their purpose was in those far-off lands. Gollum disappeared, and the hobbits soon learned Faramir was the other son of Denethor, steward of Gondor. Faramir deemed them friends and allies of their cause, but he and his men were preparing for an impending battle. 2 of his soldiers were left to guard the hobbits as Faramir departed, They were named Mablung and Damrod, rangers of Ithilien and of the line of the Dunedain. They told the hobbits that they were battling the Haradrim, and though Gondor was a proud realm, it was in decay. The city of Minas Tirith was in dire straits, beleaguered by Sauron, but Faramir now led a valiant resistance against the invaders. As the hobbits hid with their guard, sounds of battle drifted towards them. Frodo and Sam then caught a glimpse of their first battle of men against men, and also saw their first Oliphant. With nothing else to do, they fell asleep and waited for the return of Faramir. The battle concluded, and Frodo was brought before Faramir and his company of 300 or so men. He was questioned about his quest, but refused to give over any specific details about the ring. The men of Gondor were encouraged upon hearing Aragorn, the heir of Elendil, had resurfaced and now fought against Sauron. Faramir then revealed to Frodo the death of Boromir, and it now appeared he suspected Frodo of betraying his brother to the orcs. An exhausted Frodo, as Sam also rose to his defense, expressed his grief and began to worry of the fates of the rest of the Fellowship. "Will you not put aside your doubt of me and let me go? I am weary, and full of grief and afraid, but I have a deed to do, or to attempt, before I too am slain. In the more need of haste, if we two halflings are all that remain of our fellowship. Go back, Faramir, valiant captain of Gondor, and defend your city while you may, and let me go where my doom takes me." Faramir decreed he trusted Frodo in his intentions, but that out of duty to his father in Gondor he was to take him back to Minas Tirith. Frodo and Sam remained with the company of Gondor, and were blindfolded and led to their hideout nearby. Faramir continued to question Frodo of the ring, which he only knew as the Isildur's Bane. However, he confided that even in the direst of straits he would never be driven to use it for himself, whereas Frodo knew that temptation had been the downfall of the mighty Boromir. With this, Faramir proved himself wiser in matters of the world than his brother, though he was still unfairly regarded as the lesser of the sons of Denethor. For myself, I would see the white tree in flower again in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown return, and Minas Tirith in peace. Minas Anor again as of old, full of light, high and fair, beautiful as a queen among other queens. War must be, while we defend our lives against the destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, the city of the men of Númenor, and I would have her love for her memory, her ancientry, her beauty, and her present wisdom." Frodo was nearly driven to ask the noble Faramir for counsel, but his heart held him back, for he remembered the fears and sorrows that had followed him and Sam. He deemed it better to wrongly mistrust Faramir rather than risk the ring corrupting him as it did Boromir. They at last reached the hideout of the company, a hidden cave where Faramir showed Frodo the window of the sunset, a shimmering chamber behind a waterfall. The level shafts of the setting sun behind beat upon it, and the red light was broken into many flickering beams of ever-changing color. It was as if they stood at the window of some elven tower, curtained with threaded jewels of silver and gold, and ruby, sapphire and amethyst, all kindled with an unconsuming fire. There Frodo and Sam were sheltered and fed. Faramir told them tales of Númenor, and learned of Boromir's fateful impulse to take the ring for the good of Gondor. He was taken aback, but assured Frodo he had no intentions of doing the same. Frodo at last revealed his end goal of destroying the ring, and swayed and fell asleep at the table. Faramir gently picked him up, and took him and Sam to their beds. There Sam bowed deeply to the captain of Gondor, praising his worth and quality as a leader of men. Later that night, Faramir woke Frodo, saying there was an urgent matter he needed to be present for. Frodo was led through an enchanting evening landscape before coming to a deep oval basin. There below was a small dark creature, revealed to be Gollum. Faramir prepared to give orders for his men to shoot to kill, but Frodo intervened, begging them to spare Gollum's life. Faramir was stunned to learn that Gollum had carried the ring for many years, and wanted to question him as well. Frodo was allowed to go down and talk to Gollum, he was forced to trick Gollum to guide him away from the water, and when Gollum was captured by the men of Faramir, he felt betrayed by Frodo. Faramir then sharply questioned Gollum, asking him of his intentions and if he was familiar with the lands of Ithilien. Gollum was then released, and Faramir decreed Frodo to be free in the realm of Gondor under his protection, with Gollum in turn under Frodo's care. Upon learning of their destination of Cirith Ungol, he then pulled Frodo aside and urged him to be cautious, for the evil of the ring seemed to be taking a deeper hold on Gollum. Frodo learned the High Pass was in the valley of Minas Morgul, the abode of the Nazgul. However, it was the only path left forwards, and Faramir relented to let the hobbits continue. They prepared to depart with Gollum, with Faramir resupplying them and bidding a thankful Frodo farewell. Most gracious host, it was said to me by Elrond Half-Elven that I should find friendship upon the way, secret and unlooked for. Certainly I looked for no such friendship as you have shown. To have found it turns evil to great good. Then the hobbits left Faramir and his men, and guided by Gollum journeyed for the crossroads that led to the Morgul Vale. For several days they walked until they reached Minas Morgul, the defiled Tower of the Moon. The air became foul and heavier as the tower loomed over them, and they stood just before its terrible white bridge. The hobbit steps became heavier and slower, with Gollum pushing their pace. The ring seemed to drag Frodo towards the citadel, but he was kept on the path by Sam and Gollum. Then there was a tremendous rumbling in the ground, and bright red light erupted from the tower and painted the sky the color of blood. Lightning burst from Minas Morgul, and a piercing cry began to echo. An army issued forth from its gates, led by the Witch King of Angmar, greatest and most terrible of the nine. It was he who had stabbed Frodo on Weathertop, and now Frodo felt frozen in place. He felt his hand creeping towards the ring, but by the strength of his own will he grabbed the phial given to him by Galadriel, and the urge vanished. The Witch King and his army passed the hiding hobbits and Gollum, filling them with despair. Soon he had passed, like a shadow into shadow, down the winding road, and behind him still the black ranks crossed the bridge. So great an army had never been issued from that vale since the days of Isildur's might. No host so fell and strong had yet assailed the fords of Anduin. And yet it was but one and not the greatest of the hosts that Mordor now sent forth. Frodo now worried their quest was in vain, and wept as the army of the Witch King marched past. But then Sam stirred him, and with grim determination they set out for the winding staircase. Upwards they climbed for a long while, until Frodo stopped to rest. They fell asleep, and while dozing, Gollum came up to them. For the briefest of moments, Smeagol was reawakened within him, and he looked on Frodo and Sam with care, and was nearly redeemed from the evil corruption of the ring. But by ill luck, Frodo stirred and Sam awoke to see Gollum's hand on his master. He shooed him away, and the moment of potential redemption left Gollum, a glint returning to his eyes. Eventually they came to the next part of their journey, a dark, foreboding cave, and it was only Gollum among them who knew its true name, Torek Ungol, Shelob's lair. Despite a foul smell and the ever-present threat of orcs lurking inside, Frodo and Sam steeled themselves and ventured inside. It was suffocating within, with no light to be had. Gollum, in an act of treachery, then abandoned Frodo and Sam to their own devices, hoping the massive spider Shelob would kill them and he could take the ring back for himself. The hobbits quickly became lost in the darkness, until Frodo remembered the light of Eorendil given to him by Lady Galadriel, shouting Aya Eorendil Elenion an Kalima as he brought it forth. And they could see clearly once more, but that radiant light illuminated a new threat. But other potencies there are in Middle-earth, powers of night, and they are old and strong. And she that walked in the darkness had heard the elves cry that cry far back in the deeps of time, and she had not heeded it, and it did not daunt her now. And Frodo and Sam then saw faint glittering lights that radiated malice and darkness, for it was Shelob, the ancient, monstrous spider who lurked in those caves and now saw fresh prey. Long she had dwelt in the caves, since the days of Beren and Luthien and before the construction of Barad-dûr. Gollum, after he had fallen to darkness, had encountered Shelob in her lair and began to worship her. The radiance of the Starglass was broken and thrown back from their thousand facets, but behind the glitter a pale, deadly fire began to steadily glow within, a flame kindled in some deep pit of evil thought. Monstrous and abominable eyes they were, bestial and yet filled with purpose and with hideous delight, gloating over their prey trapped beyond all hope of escape. Fear struck deep in the hearts of Frodo and Sam, but Frodo once more found his courage. He held the file high and drew Sting, and began to walk forwards. Sting flashed out, and the sharp elven blade flickered in the silver light, but at its edges a blue fire flickered. Then holding the star aloft and the bright sword advanced, Frodo, Hobbit of the Shire, walked steadily down to meet the eyes. So powerful was the majesty of the starlight that Shelob felt doubt, and ran away. Using Sting, Frodo and Sam advanced forwards, cutting down the cobwebs of Shelob as they went. Frodo spied the exit and raced ahead. Sam still felt uneasy, and then saw Shelob scuttling near them from an exit nearby. She immediately went towards an unaware Frodo, and Sam tried to warn his friend. But Gollum appeared, and covered Sam's mouth with his hand. Sam exploded with anger, wrenching himself free and drawing his sword. He tried to stab his attacker, but Gollum was quick and danced away. They brawled, with Sam landing several blows with the staff on Gollum. Gollum fled, but elsewhere Frodo had been captured by Shelob. She had ensnared him in cobwebs and was dragging him away. But now Sam charged at her, determined to save Frodo. No onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts. Sam scored several slashing blows on a bewildered Shelob, and while underneath her in the fight managed to stab her in the underbelly. Shelob reeled away, and Sam rushed to a prone Frodo, discovering him in a deep swoon from the spider's poison. Furious, he grabbed Galadriel's phial and turned to face Shelob again. As if his indomitable spirit had set its potency in motion, the glass blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that, leaping from the firmament, sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror out of heaven had ever burned in Shelob's face before. Shelob reeled in pain and agony, and fled once and for all from the terrible wrath of Samwise Gamgee. Sam looked back at Frodo, dismayed to find there was no heartbeat. He passed out, as during the fight he had been stung in the neck by Shelob. Sam awoke some time later, believing Frodo to be dead. With great sorrow, he took Sting and Frodo's mithril, and now knew the burden of destroying the ring had fallen to him. And then he bent his own neck and put the chain upon it, and at once his head was bowed to the ground with the weight of the ring, as if a great stone had been strung on him. But slowly, as if the weight became less, or new strength grew in him, he raised his head, and then with a great effort got to his feet and found he could walk and bear his burden. Thus Samwise Gamgee became the next ring-bearer, and as he walked on he soon heard orc voices approaching rapidly. There was nowhere to hide, and with no other option he put on the ring. The world grew gray and hazy, and Sam hid as the orcs marched past. He found he could understand their black speech perfectly. He listened as they discovered Frodo's body and moved it back to their lair. Sam followed the orcs through the tunnels, determined to not let them defile his friend. Stunningly, he then learned that Frodo wasn't actually dead, just rendered immobile. The orcs reached their watchtower, and the door slammed shut, sealing a very much alive Frodo away from Sam.